Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all of our viewers who have tuned in to today's Milestones Roundtable. Um, Today's conversation is going to be a critical and thoughtful discussion on the murder of George Floyd, but also discussing the political aftermath thereof. So, from the uprisings to the political analyses and the political responses that have kind of been elicited from it. And today, since it's also the Day of Outrage, which is part of a larger Muslim organizational response to demonstrate solidarity, Milestones felt it was important to have kind of a public conversation discussing more about how we can deconstruct and read the mass militancy currently happening on the grounds. So we'll be kind of deconstructing not only the origin of the rebellions, like the uprisings we're seeing now, but also popular narratives like the outside agitator, and how us in the movement, should better read the mass militancy occurring going forward. So I want to provide a disclaimer. These are the individual reflections of the panelists, and they do not reflect the views and the values of the Milestones editorial board. We are here to have a critical discussion to conceptualize and to contextualize the current historical moment. So with that, if anyone throughout this entire discussion has any questions or comments, please comment them below and we'll be sure to get through them. So I want to begin by first introducing our panel today. So I want to begin with, first we have Abdulrahman. He is a new African Muslim, sincerely striving in the way of Allah, and is a community activist and organizer. We have Tanzeen, who is an anthropologist of Islam and also the general editor of Milestones. We also have Hannibal, who is a contributor and researcher for Milestones and also a community organizer. And we have Timothy, who is a youth developer and community activist based in Oakland. We have Imran, who is a community, financial, and legal advisor, helps us a lot with Milestones here. And last but not least, we have George Ciccarello, who is an organizer, a writer, and a political theorist. He is also the author of 3 important books, We Created Chavez, Building the Commune, and Decolonizing Dialectics. So thank you guys so much for joining us here today. So to begin, I want to start off with a general question posed to the entire panel. If each panelist can give like a few words about how do you view the murder of George Floyd, and what are the causes of these kinds of killing that appears foundational in the way America functions?
I guess I'll start. I view the murder of George Floyd as just an ongoing assault from the United States on the Black community. It happens every day, every hour in the United States. And I definitely think that is part of the foundation of America, to keep certain segments of the population oppressed, and just an ongoing campaign of white superiority and capitalism.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and follow up behind Tim since we're on the same mic here. And I would just say, you know, my perspective, I mean, because Tim got it pretty well, but the one thing I would add to that is that, you know, when we see these type of murders, my opinion and what I feel like I'm witnessing is they're not doing these things out of fear. A lot of times we're taught that, you know, police are killing people out of fear of their own safety. But the way I perceive it, it's an act of dominance. You know, it's a way to exert control and power over a whole population by doing these types of things in public. It goes back to European history and slave history of, you know, disciplining the outlier or the slave or the outsider or the non-human, disciplining them by means of exerting force and violence on them as a public spectacle in front of everyone, just like we see with George Floyd.
Abdulrahman, you want to follow up with that?
Sure. It was a lynching, straight up. It was a lynching. I think what's important about it is that it's the display of the essential means by which the state was created, perpetuated, and maintained. And it's violence, period, point blank, end of story. It's terrorism on the African and oppressed communities. Well, I feel like it has multiple folds in its strategy. It's psychological warfare as a means to hopefully suppress the rebellious spirit of the oppressed masses, but then it's also a way to maintain the structure in which this society not only survives, but essentially claims to thrive. It's off the bloodshed of African people. So I feel like it was just straight up a lynching, a modern day lynching, and it was a picture perfect definition of what actual violence in the state looked like.
Thank you so much for that. George, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's said. I would say, I think Hannibal's point was key, which is that, I think where we can put our finger on the way that this is played historically into capitalist development, into economic imperatives, into disciplining a workforce. I mean, these things continue when Black people are pushed out of the workforce too. It continues when they're pushed into prisons and into ghettos and contained. And so alongside the economic piece is, as Hannibal put it, the control piece, the dominance piece. And for me, that gets to the fact that alongside the economic is also the symbolic, right? There's a symbolic dominance that's being performed. In this instant, of course, he was not, Derek Chauvin was not fearful, but he was also not fearful because he was, in the process of repeating that dominance that prevents him from being fearful later on. Right? It's part of this fear, this control of dangerous groups, and these dangerous groups shift over time. But of course, the fundamental fear of Blackness in the United States is something that that hasn't shifted much. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tanzeen or Imran. You guys want to comment on that as well? Just your general views of regarding the murder of George Floyd.
I can add a little bit. Almost everything is covered, really. I would just add that we just got off the roundtable with Frank Wilderson, and one of the things that he focuses in his work is this question of the psychic regeneration of the world, and how to enforce gratuitous violence on Black bodies. And that is really significant because only looking at political economy doesn't tell us why there was excess to the violence, right? So political economy tells us why there has to be certain forms of violence, but it doesn't tell us the excess of violence. Why was there this need to do a certain kind of psychic oppression? And what does the white man go through as well when he does that? And why does he need to do that on bodies of slaves, so to speak? And so this is very significant. Fanon talked about that. Every white man who hates the Black, in some ways, there's also a deep psychosexual structure to that. That there is he said there's a repressed homosexuality, actually. So this kind of cruelty and brutality, a kind of libidinal economy, is really significant for us to understand that there is a materiality to it that goes beyond the political structure and the economic structure. One other thing that I would quickly mention is that because in some ways, Milestones is so focused on how to think about religion in terms of political theory, is Sylvia Wynter, who's another writer, talked about de-godding to understand the sovereign man. And the sovereign man is sort of articulated in the master, so the white man. And that happens through a de-godding of the sort of the political epistemology. And that's really important to understand because in some ways, it is a manner in which Blacks are not given access to their own epistemic, metaphysical assumptions about how the world should work for him. And this is a permanent feature of the way it's structured between the slave and the master. So the emergence of this, right? It's basically making sure that Blacks are not people. Peoplehood is inaccessible to Black people, right? So this is a very important part of how, what it shows. The symbolic dimension actually has a literal structure to it. Something we should pay attention to.
Oh, thank you so much for Tanzid. I think that's a very important point, because I think you see from whenever a murder happens, a lynching happens, you see like a lot of people come out with legal solutions or social solutions, but not really analyzing the deeper structures of like ontology of like our positions, how we relate to one another. So that's a very important point. Imran, do you have any I guess your own views of like the murder of George Floyd, how that relates to just like how America functions as well?
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody pretty much covered a lot of the main points regarding to George Floyd's execution by the U.S. police. I mean, I just think that it's consistent with America's history ever since its inception. Ever since the first colonizers arrived on Native American land, they have been continuing to use this type of brutal force against anybody that's in their way that gets in the way of their project, of the American project.
Yeah,
I think they've been consistent.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And I think a lot of what the current historical moment kind of is displaying right now is this growing mass militancy, right? So not just, kind of the simple, like, protests organized just by kind of by nonprofits or things like that, but you see real like riots, rebellions happening, like even in Minneapolis, you see the burning down of a police precinct, something that people have never really kind of accomplished, kind of like in this current moment. So I think just asking you guys, since we're all kind of based in different cities and have kind of partaken to some degree in some of these protests, what have you guys seen in your own respective cities? I think I'll start with Tim and Hannibal.
Thank you. In Oakland, I have seen. You got to understand that this is something that's not new in the United States, but it's definitely not new to Oakland. There's been like foundations set, like with the Oscar Grant movement, for example, where we have risen up against the state before. And so what I've seen is basically the first couple nights, first 3 nights were really the most, I would say, impacted people that were really sincere out there. And that's when you're seeing a lot of property destruction going on, a lot of riots going on. But then I feel like the administration of Oakland, the politicians, the nonprofits, when they see that the energy is coming from what you could call the lumpen, the most affected people in the city, they all scramble to try to jump in front of it. So that's pretty much what I've seen in Oakland. I feel like that the real rebellion is coming from something that's not structured, it's not organized, it's not a nonprofit, it's not a politician, it's people on the streets taking action in their own way. I mean, like, it's spread. Like they hit the Benz places, they hit some car places in East Oakland. Like it was spotted all over. But when you get to like the nonprofits and the politicians, everybody comes to 14th and Broadway, Oscar Grant Plaza, so that's the more structured protest where they be like, it's a non-violent, you can bring your kids, it's more like a parade, So I think there's nothing, I don't want to demonize that or say there's anything wrong with that, but I feel like there is always some fashion that's always trying to control rebellions. And the more radical perspectives always get isolated and pushed to the outskirts of what's happening. And I feel like it's somewhere we've been before. As far as like we have done this before it's like a rerun being played over. And I get more motivated when I see that things are progressing, like the actions are taking more of a political turn, like in Minneapolis where some of the targets were police stations. You know, like I feel like that is when it's a sign of the mass consciousness changing. In Oakland, I feel like that is not the consciousness hasn't changed on the people that are supposed to be, you know, leading these so-called movements.
Well, thank
you
so much,
and I mean,
Hannibal.
If I could add to that, you know, I specifically in Oakland, I was out there. I believe it was the second night is when I first got out there. The second night of actions in Oakland, which was maybe, you know, I want to say it was 2 or 3 days after things really got heated up in Minnesota. And what I mean, first of all, to kind of comment on the way things heat up in Minnesota, and I know I wasn't there, but, you know, in terms of, you know, paying attention to the developments from, you know, these things escalating, I feel like we always witness this moment where the people who are most affected by this, who see themselves in those murders, who see themselves as like, I feel like they just killed me, or I feel like they just killed someone who looks just like my father, or someone who looks just like my sister, or whatever the case may be. It's like a dire situation. It's like a desperate situation. Like we keep watching this happen and nothing's happening. And I feel that's what causes people to resort to very extreme measures, because it's like, you know, we've marched so many times. I mean, we've literally been marching for, you know, over 50 years. I mean, if we go back to the civil rights era, or the quote unquote civil rights era, you know, people were marching then for this very same reasons. And then, you know, people see this happening and it's like, something has to happen. Something needs to happen that's going to force people to look at the issue and address the issue, right? And I don't think people just want to go out destroying things, but I think it's like a, you know, it's a very like, I think it's a clear connection between nobody's doing anything about this and the fear of, you know, being rolled on by the streets and being rolled on by the masses. It calls people into action, and it calls everyone into action. It calls the police into action. Now they're taking these. It calls, you know, the quote unquote civil rights leaders, or the, you know, quote unquote grassroots organizations, you know, it calls them into action even when they haven't been active, right? So I feel like that's a big part of it. And then specifically in Oakland, what I witnessed is that, you know, people were trying really, really hard to get to the police station. And the closer they got to the police station, the more violent the police became. By the time people got close to the police station, every couple seconds, there's tear gas canisters exploding around us. You know, and some people may be familiar with the fact that I was live streaming when I was out there. We were close. We were very close to the police station, and police became very aggressive, you know, and I didn't see any property damage until the police were successfully able to move people away from the police station. And I truly believe that it was kind of like a secondary thought process for people. I can't really comment to why exactly people did those things, because I don't know exactly who did those things. And I wouldn't want to speculate either. And I certainly don't like the idea of calling them provocateurs. But I know that they certainly were trying very hard to get to the police station, and the police were trying even harder to keep them from it.
And if I could interject a really short point, is that the police in Oakland are very familiar with the area of Broadway and 14th over there. I would assume that they have maps of almost every street of downtown, because all of it tends to, whenever something happens, everybody congregates to 14th and Broadway automatically, just like that. So I believe that they already have strategies in place to keep people away from police stations, kettle people in. And so I feel like that's why
What's kettle? Because people might not know what that means.
Kettle is when a lot of people, when you're protesting, they walk up on police lines and then they form another police line behind you. So then you're trapped. You have nowhere to go. So they have certain tactics that they're very familiar with, especially in the downtown area. And that's what made these rebellions a little different in Oakland, because it just, after a couple of nights, it didn't center on downtown, just the downtown area anymore. It spread out across the whole city.
No, thank you guys so much for just for that response. It's very illuminating. I think I want to go to Tanzeen, just from your experiences and like what you've seen. I think being based kind of like in Minneapolis as well, just kind of share what you've seen.
I should not have muted. Yeah, I'm based like 45 minutes away from Minneapolis. As soon as I heard about that this is going to happen to the police station, and I started moving there, I couldn't miss this opportunity to witness history. I think there is something new. I think it's both a continuation and something new. I think what happened in Minneapolis is a very big shift into having the courage to actually burn down the police station. And it was not just one or two people, it was a mass celebration of the decimation of the police as a symbol, as a structure. And I think that started a new form of militancy. And the reason why I've been using the word mass militancy is because I think it's very important to not look at it as demonstration or a protest. And Hannibal was saying, it's not a march, it's not a rally. Maybe those things happen between, but what I saw was a very different kind of consciousness, a different kind of, there's an affective response, but I don't also like to think of it only as like trying to be ungovernable. I think there was something else in it, which was about a confrontational politics, and very immediately a kind of confrontational politics. And there was a mass to mass kind of development happening because there's like a new sociality. It was a confrontation also against the status quo of the masses, right? What they are normally used to is kind of like a reformed America status. Like even if you're political, a lot of political conversations end up being legal or educational, is because there's an interest in trying to fix it in a way, those kind of quick solutions. And this was not at all that, at least not in Minneapolis. I'm sure there's contingent differences in different states. But Minneapolis took the lead this time, and because of the location of where Floyd was murdered and so on. So I think in this sense, it is very important for us not to frame it only as trying to be ungovernable, as if some kind of interest only in that, or trying to think of it as a form of demonstration of frustration. I think it was much more pointed and much more tactically efficient, and it had this consistency that I haven't seen before. So it was an attack on the way I'm getting sorry, my bad. I couldn't hear myself. So yeah, it's an attack on how normally protest culture, let's say, happens. It was a surprise for the cops. When I was there on the third night, when the third precinct, when it was happening, everything was spontaneous in the way that it could actually trick the police. And the police were very overpowered by the mass militancy, because it was not a few, here and there, couple of people who were disrupting. It was like at the mass level, different forms of disruption. So whether it's property damage and so on, all of those conversations are really significant, because I'm sure we're going to cover all of that. But it's important to understand that the question of property is also something, the way news media is talking about it, as if it's the people who fought against that they're like, they have some kind of access to this kind of property relation. And that's simply not the case. So what people were fighting against was actually this, the capitalist dominant class having access to certain degree of wealth and a certain degree of mobility, and being able to utilize the American project for themselves. So there's a clear understanding of that among the masses of very young people, by the way. I was there also to give dawah to, this is a Somali population, and there was a lot of Somali Muslims there. There was a huge population of Somali Muslims, and there were also African Americans. So it was a great interaction, a kind of connection that is only possible in struggle, which is was very significant for me to see. I mean, over the last, I would say 20 years of what I've seen in the United States, this was phenomenal. And something that is really a lot to learn from Minneapolis, I think.
No, thank you so much for that, Tanzeen. And I think you came across a point that is kind of like, not really expanded a lot, but just speaking about the political intelligence of, like, you know, the very young people who, from the outside, it seemed like it was just like the super spontaneous riot, and then people didn't know what they were doing. They were just kind of destroying. But also for us to understand like how intelligent and tactically efficient those rioters were is just kind of very important to note as well. I want to go to Abdulrahman to share his observations as well from where he's based at.
I wanted to kind of like piggyback off some of the stuff that I heard Hannibal and Tim say, particularly as it relates to the Trayvon Martin rebellions in Oakland. Primarily, and I know we have like a list of talking points, and I will get to this more in depth later, but the narrative that I'm seeing that is a holdover, for my analysis, there's a narrative that's a holdover from our elders' generation, largely with the idea that riots or rebellions don't work, the argument that people are tearing up their own community, and the argument that the people responsible for this come from other than the community in which the stuff is happening. So one point that because I've noticed that within some of the commentary of what's happened with the George Floyd rebellions is that, you know, people don't take into account that there are different conditions in which that phrase might have been applicable, which, you know, is arguable whether or not it was, but the conditions are very different, particularly within the Black community, who home ownership, business ownership is significantly down, as well as you could argue something that's not necessarily materially tangible, like unity, is significantly down. So even if that argument was a valid argument then, it's definitely not a valid argument now, in my opinion. But also, I think what's different with, and we could see that the same exact narrative happened with the Trayvon rebellions. Like, it was instantly, people were quick to label whatever type of anything other than the realm of nonviolent or peaceful resistance as white outside agitators and agent provocateurs. But what I think, and we saw that with both, I think, Trayvon and this, but what I think is different with this time is we see in the face of that narrative, the youth or the masses are completely rejecting the idea that it's better to be bit with a smile than with a frown. So people are rejecting the idea that somehow we can politely convince our oppressor that they should change. And starting to see a lot more empirical evidence that talks about the material way in which rebellions actually do force concessions, as well as like actually start to force the state to at least posture as if it cares, as opposed to, you know, choosing to be bit with a smile as long as they want, you know, and make it continually, you know, oh, progress is coming. So I think with this one, what was different is what we see is
hey, Salam, brother. I don't know if everyone's having this, but your words are getting jumbled up a bit, the sound.
Okay.
So the last sentence I didn't hear so clearly.
It's echoing a little bit. That's the thing.
Okay. How about now? Better now? Or?
Probably the audio from maybe the phone.
I just turned it off.
For now, and unless until Abdulrahman can get the audio worked out, maybe if Imran, if you want to share your observations.
Yeah, sure. And I can kind of piggyback a little bit off of Abdulrahman was talking about as far as like the community. one of the critiques that we've been hearing a lot is about, you know, the looting and the partial burning of one of the Target stores in Minneapolis. And this particular store was about 3 miles away from where George Floyd was murdered. And there's actually an interesting history of this Target store in that, first of all, Minneapolis, I believe, is the headquarters of Target. And Target has actually funded programs with the police in Minneapolis called the Safe Zone Program, which they have used that particular Target as an experimental site for loss prevention and surveillance in that community. And that program was actually modeled after a program that was used in England against the Irish Republican Army, which is kind of interesting about that. And this program goes back as far as 2010. And this program has been implemented across other Target stores, but this particular Target store has worked very closely with the Minneapolis Police Department, and they actually provide them a lot of financial and intellectual support. And a lot of local members of the community have said that nobody likes this Target in this community, which isn't surprising, seeing as how it's used. You know, they have police embedded in the store, which kind of reminds you of, you know, going shopping in, you know, an occupied territory somewhere, maybe in the Middle East. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. And then another thing I wanted to bring up is Target actually, you know, has donated $300,000 for this program. I mean, so if you're saying that Target is part of the community, and why are people angry at these stores in their community? Are they really part of the community? If they're, you know, when you go shopping to buy food and diapers and medicine and essential supplies, especially during this global pandemic, you're being surveilled by the police when you're buying these essential supplies. Is it really part of your community? And another thing that we've heard from the ground there is that when a lot of the protests were happening and police were using tear gas and pepper spray, that Target would actually not sell milk to the protesters to help them. So that's also one of the reasons perhaps why the store was targeted. But so it goes back to a long history of thinking about, you know, why is Target using these type of tactics in their so-called community? I mean, if you juxtapose this with another store in the community, there was actually another small business owner, a Bangladeshi businessman, who owned a restaurant in the city. And he was there in the community for many years. And he was actually helping protesters by allowing them to come inside and seek refuge from the police when they were being attacked. And unfortunately, his restaurant was burned down, but he actually come out and said that, you know, I've experienced this type of police brutality in my home country of Bangladesh. So, you know, my building can come back, but, you know, justice has to be, you know, has to be recognized, and, you know, people have to, you know, come out and take these actions to let their voices be heard.
Yeah, no, I think that really ties in well with like Tanzeen's point about just like the mass consciousness of like the people rebelling right now, how intelligent it is. For example, they understand very intimately, even like, you know, as young as like, you know, even teenagers, understanding really well like what their social positions are and their relationship to like property and business ownership. So it's very important. I want to go to George to kind of just share your observations from your experiences, like, you know, participating in your local protests as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I guess the first thing to say is that almost everything I know, I learned in Oakland. And so it's a question of these lessons being repeated over and over again, becoming clearer, becoming more acute, because I think we're at a higher historical level than maybe we were. I think the cycle set in motion in Oakland became a national cycle, right? And we've shown how, for example, struggles in Oakland set off not only Occupy Wall Street and others, student occupations, but then reverberated through Occupy Oakland, making it so radical, and set the stage really for what has come since, you know, Black Lives Matter, struggles nationwide. And what I learned in Oakland were a number of things. You know, the first was that, as CLR James says, the rich are only defeated when running for their lives. In other words, when the material force is brought this is when the state begins to act. And it was crystal clear. And it was the same thing that's happening in Minneapolis today. No one was arrested when Oscar Grant was killed until there was a riot. And then the question of the charges, and then there was a riot. And then there's a question of, you know, of bail, and there's another riot. And this is absolutely undeniable. We see, and again, if you look at the sort of academic intellectual scene, there are people that go out of their way and become very famous in the process. One name is Omar Wasso at Princeton, who has all these statistical analyses about how rioting makes people more conservative, right? It's all about the backlash. And this is always filtered through the Democratic Party. It's always filtered through voting, and it's super dubious, right? And it can't answer the fact that we've seen already calls to disband the Minneapolis police taken up by city council, or the fact that they've cut ties to the school police, you know, the school district, or that Los Angeles is defunding by $150 million. And these are just small things, or that 6 or 7 more cops have been arrested or suspended nationwide.
Yeah.
These are direct responses that are, you know, in response to resistance in the streets, because it's until people make that force felt in the streets that something is going to change. Unfortunately, we also learned, like Tim mentioned, that the nonprofit apparatus is always there and ready to step in. I think, and we dealt with that back in the day, as you all remember. I think what's different about the Bay is that the nonprofits are on the left, and they're very much embedded with the movements. And so they're there and ready from the very jump. I think a lot of places, if you look at like Baltimore, you know, the headline is like, after the riots, then the nonprofits show up, right? And so there are some places I think that nonprofits are already in place as a containment apparatus, and other places where they're kind of less thick and less present. And so, you know, that's one of the other questions that, you know, has retained its relevance, I think, nationwide, and that people will step in and try to contain the struggle and try to redirect it through this narrative of the outside agitators. We know that this is an old narrative. We know it goes back to slavery. It goes back to Klan times, Jim Crow. And it's based fundamentally, and this is the point that I always try to make, on what Tanzeen mentioned at the beginning, namely the fact that enslaved and colonized people, the dominators and the masters cannot conceive that they are human enough to want to resist, right? The idea is that they're happy, right? If they're not happy, either they must be savages by nature, or someone's here stirring them up. If you look at the US, it was the British were stirring them up, or the Indians, or the Haitian Revolution was getting people all agitated. And it was always the desperate attempt to find someone else causing the problem. And in practice, what we saw in Oakland, and you could still find, I think, the traces of this in the news stories, was that it was the police feeding this to the media. It was the police feeding this to the city, you know, apparatus, who was then echoing. You find this today. If you watch CNN, if you watch any, you know, I'm engaging with the media a lot, and all they want to talk about is Antifa and outside agitators. And it's not even because they're right wing. It's not even because they totally buy Trump's obsession with Antifa, but it's because they themselves can't conceive of, well, you know, we see this happening, and we can't give enough credit to communities that they're actually resisting, and give enough credit to them that they understand that nothing else has worked, which is the fundamental kind of liberal pretense, I think, is that politics works in a certain kind of way. It's peaceful, it's voting, it's this and that, when that is never politics has worked. And I think we know this. So I think Philly has probably shown a similar arc to what people have talked about in the Bay and other places. The first day was a really shockingly large outpouring. It's probably 3,000 or 4,000 people showed up to a call that was not really put out very broadly. It just people showed up, right? You know, when you have a situation where 10 times as many people confirm on Facebook show up, you're in a different situation, because that's the opposite ratio of what we normally have. So people showed up. The rage was directed precisely and, you know, mechanically at the police. 6 police vehicles were burned. You may have seen images of 2 burning and exploding really outside of City Hall. I have never seen that targeted precision. It's happened in Los Angeles, it's happened in Minneapolis, it's happened in Brooklyn. You know, I think that is an indication of the high level of struggle that we're at. That the targeting of police so directly has been, part of this struggle. That evening was just mass looting in Center City, which is the sort of wealthy financial commercial district, you know, of the center of Philadelphia, and everything. And it was the same as Oakland back in 2009, It was kind of joyous interaction. Everyone there was being friendly to each other. People were getting baby clothes, you know, and you know, and there was nothing wrong, you know.
Yeah.
This was the day that shakes the apparatus awake, though, of course. The next day was dispersed looting and fighting the police in different parts of the city, including in deep West Philly, where we're at, where it was a totally different crowd, where it was young, you know, I want to say 14 to 20-year-olds, you know, almost entirely Black West Philadelphians, looting, throwing down with the police because someone had put out the call to go to Foot Locker. And again, Foot Locker in Oakland was one of the first things looted. And so in West Philly, this happened, and the next thing you know, there's an armored personnel carrier shooting tear gas. But the police were too undermanned to really deal with it. They were dealing with looting in North Philly, South Philly, elsewhere, and they couldn't get back up. So they basically let the looting go for a while, shoot some tear gas once in a while. The next day after that, another big march downtown, gets on the highway, brutalized, tear gas, rubber bullets, concussion grenades. Another part of this equation is that we have a new police commissioner she came in from Portland, Oregon. And so she's really showing what her plans are for how to police the city. She's on the one hand making hay out of the fact that she's a Black woman, she's a reformer, et cetera. And then, you know, on the other side, allowing the police to really be even more brutal than the last commissioner. Since then, there's been a kind of taming of some of the marches. I think there may be different forces behind this. Some people have have ended up in debates with people that are more like, almost like Instagram celebrities, self-promoters who no one knew who they were before, and suddenly they're at the front of marches. There's maybe some Ivy League, you know, middle class leadership that stepped in, but it's been more the past couple of days, more hands up, don't shoot than direct conflict with the police. I don't know that will necessarily hold. There's a big march scheduled for tomorrow, and you know, we'll see what happens from there. The National Guard is still here. Maybe they'll leave, but that's sort of the situation on the ground. But the containment apparatus is kicking in. The media is having its effect, where it's like, oh, of course we support. And here's again, we can measure, I think, the high level of struggle from the fact that every media outlet has, in an unprecedented way, had to recognize the importance of this struggle, right? 74% of people recognizing that police brutality is an issue to be dealt with. That's, 74%. That means some of Trump supporters, police brutality is an issue. 54% polled support the burning of the police station in Minneapolis as a direct response. And so we're at the higher level, but if you just tune into CNN for a few minutes, you see that from the other side of their mouth, they're trying to play the outside agitator role. They're trying to say, of course, it's good that there's some white people here, but Chris Cuomo was saying, watch them, they'll be burning things later, or they'll be breaking things later. And so they're playing this divisive game that, if we let it play out, is going to be incredibly dangerous. So the outside agitator trope is the one that's being deployed, I think, with full force. And I think the response to that is a couple of things. One is, as we said, communities are engaging in struggle because they're fed up, right? We know why. Just like people knew under Jim Crow, just like people knew under slavery why, and yet they acted like they didn't understand why. And so that's the one piece. And then the other piece is that, of course, we want people to stand in solidarity, right? If people are out there struggling alongside communities of color and colonized peoples against the police, that's a good thing, right? Like that is something to be celebrated, I think, and not to be, to be decried. But I think policing, the terrorism stuff around Antifa is going to be deployed with full force.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, George. You stumbled on just very good points that I think have been very prevalent in the way that people have been discussing this. So from my observation, what I'm seeing is there's one thing about what is really violence. How do we define violence? Another thing, the narrative of the outside agitators, how the rioters, it's not really their fault. It's just all these, outside agitators coming in, kind of like underestimating or understating the militancy of the moment. And also this dichotomy, of like the bad versus good protesters. So just me personally, I'm stationed, I live in South Florida, and we had two major protests. We had one in Miami and one in Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale is more north up. And I think kind of similarly, what kind of happened in Philly and other places, like in the beginning, the first major one, it was a lot more looting, like mass looting. I mean, in the downtown area, we have like a lot of rich people, a lot of rich Cuban people who live here. So they all kind of got looted. And then when it came to the Broward one, there wasn't a lot of property destruction, but what happened is towards the end, when kind of like the organizers announced that it was finished, I think some people, it's still kind of unclear what happened, but I think some people started saying some things to the police or whatever. Something happened with the police, and the police just started tear gassing people when, you know, the march had like officially ended per like, you know, the nonprofits, what they were saying. And I think from there, a lot of people started kind of pushing this local narrative about the outside agitators. Oh no, those people aren't really the true protesters or the good protesters. They're just kind of outside people. They didn't really listen to what the organizers were saying on the ground. And I think that goes back to the point about, yes, the nonprofits, they kind of organize they create these events on Facebook, but when people actually show up, and they showed up in the thousands, they have their own kind of mass consciousness that can't be kind of dictated or policed by the nonprofits. So I want to go to Tim to ask about what's wrong with the narrative of the outside agitator. So I think this is something we should kind of deconstruct a little bit. If you can just speak a little bit about that.
Thank you. It's a great question.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a false narrative of an outside agitator. Antifa, for instance, right? Which means anti-fascist. As somebody that's politically, you know, knows a little something, I'm for anybody that's anti-fascist, you know what I'm saying? So it's hard for us to understand how, so if you're not anti-fascist, are you pro-fascist? You know, so it's like, yeah, we're culturally different, you know what I'm saying? Like there's some anarchists and you know, Antifa, which I can't I can say I'm Antifa, you know what I'm saying? Because of the principles and what they believe, you know? And I feel like our people, Black people, Africans in this place, we automatically, there's a middle bougie class buffer that automatically uses cultural differences to isolate people and put them on the outside. But if you really look into their political strategies and their political analogy, it's positive for us. It can help us get closer to our goals. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like there's a divide between anarchists, Antifa, that our community doesn't necessarily understand. And I don't want to say that it's ignorance. I'm just saying that we're culturally different. But they say fuck the police just like we say fuck the police. So we have some similar goals, you know? So when they come out there and I see, you know, and I've been in plenty of protests with, I am not antagonistic towards them at all. Not even a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry, my bad.
No, it's good.
I'm not, because I'm very passionate about this subject of the outside agitator because it's because I feel like it's something that we fall for a lot in our community. And I talk to a lot of people in my community, and a lot of them are very sincere when they say like, oh yeah, these outside white people were down there destroying property. And I'm like, yo, like, have you ever even talked to any of them? Are you just reading some, are you just having some media talking point? You know what I'm saying? So I definitely feel like there should be some sort of bridging of the gap between us. I feel like that would move the struggle a lot further than it is now, because we got to stop demonizing Antifa, you know what I'm saying? And we got to stop using those media talking points, because if you look at other countries, man, they tear stuff up. I mean, they tear stuff up, and I'm not mad at that, you know what I'm saying? Whenever I see the America burning or the buildings burning in America, I'm not shedding a tear for that, you know what I'm saying? I'm just not. And I feel like a lot of people, if they knew more about them, you know what I'm saying, and knew more about the history and the historical context of where they're coming from, they're not necessarily, there's not a lot of Black people that say they're Antifa. There's not a lot of Black people that say they're anarchists. But at the same time, there's been plenty of non-Black people who has helped our struggle, you know what I'm saying? John Brown, like, there's like, just to name one, you know, there's been and also that's what the system uses to divide us. You know what I'm saying? We're all culturally different, but at the same time, we all have the same enemy. You know what I'm saying? Like we really do. And just because somebody's not black is no reason to ostracize it. You know what I'm saying? If they're not anti-black, if they're not white supremacists, man, I feel like we should at least hear them out, you know? And if their strategy is tearing up buildings and spray painting all cops are bastards on stuff, man, I don't feel like we should stop that. You know what I'm saying? Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You know?
Yeah. And I just kind of to respond to that, you've seen kind of like from a lot of nonprofits, their response to like this militancy growing on the street is kind of like educational seminars on anti-blackness. How do we be more culturally sensitive and all these things? And it's just kind of like further proof of like how far back they are, just kind of in their analyses and like what things are going on. So I want to bring in Tanzeen to add a point to this narrative about the outside agitators as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, going off of what Tim just now said, like, first of all, so what? If there's outside, what is the outside anyway? I mean, we're talking about, that's really statist imagination, that there's an outside to Minneapolis, which is different, like somewhere else, some foreign land, someone's gonna come and, create problems for, good protesters. What's an outside of a political economy? It's just unintelligent, first of all. We should reject that just off the basis of theoretically, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So the system is a totalizing system. The response to that system is global. It's happening everywhere in the world. And in America now, there is a black militancy that's happening. And there's many people who understand this antagonism who are participating in it. And so what is this question of outside? That's like, first of all, that's a neoliberal formulation anyway. So I just think we should reject that completely. Bring in more outside agitators if that's what's needed to keep up with the struggle. I don't have a problem with that as long as the politics is right. And what we're seeing is that confrontational nature of the politics, and it has to be there. And the other problem is outside people who come in and actually try to pacify. Those are the real outsiders who come in and talk about a kind of civil society solution, educational solution, or some kind of legal solution. Yeah. I'm fine with like steps. Like I'm not, steps are fine. I mean, of course they should be prosecuted, but that's not the end of it. That doesn't mean struggle is going to stop. So this is completely about rearranging the political epistemology of how things are organized. The whole question of like when people, the reason why it's not a demonstration is because demonstration is what people do. This struggle is about, so what people do is based on what Black people are not allowed to do. So you see, it's actually against the rights of the master trying to formulate an entire world based on the genocide of Blacks and Natives. And that's really significant to understand. It's not about some basic rights that the legal system is going to provide. It has to be complete obliteration of the way politics is formulated. And so that's really important to understand. So there's no outside, who's an outside agitator? Like who? And that makes no sense. It's a global world. It's a totalizing political economy. The structure of anti-Blackness is also global. The war on terror is a global phenomena. So it makes absolutely no sense. So we should completely reject that, like always. And whoever brings that up may just not understand that part or that dimension. They might have a reaction because they can't see a world in which what we have right now is kind of the status quo, right? They can't see a world in which a new sets of social relationships are developed. They're too used to it. It's almost like naturalization of a racially violent society and trying to find some degree of comfort in it, right? And people who are engaged in this mass militancy, these young people, a lot of them are young people, are saying, we can think about something else. We want to struggle against this order to think about a different kind of order. And that's really significant, right? And in that order, there are no police forces. It's not about just police brutality, it's police itself. And that is something that needs to be understood. And police has different categories, not just uniformed people. The folks who are out there trying to organize to protect the community, and so standing in front of civilian militias who are standing and protecting the stores, that's police. Yeah, there's police right there. Zimmerman was not just a typical police, he was a community guard, right? It's the same thing. Like we fought against when he was acquitted, right? That's what Hannibal and I caught that case for fighting for Trayvon. It was about this community guard who was trying to protect and trying to act like the police. So we need to understand that policing has become part of conventional American culture. And that needs to be disrupted. And that's what these youth are saying, the one that started in Minneapolis. It was not just one kind of police. That's why this huge apartment building based on property relations, right? That whole apartment building target, these are all areas where surveillance happens. And then people, like one of the things also is that when we think about this question of the mass militancy, it's also a response from a deindustrialized population who cannot be absorbed in wage labor. Black populations don't have access to that kind of economic structure. And so as a result, they're responding to that. So when that response happens, you cannot just simply think of it as a disruption that was just simply affective, right? It had a whole structural a reason for that. Anyway, that's for now what I have in relation to the outside question.
Oh, no, that's good. I want to bring in Hannibal to respond to that as well, that point.
Yeah, I'll be brief on this. So I was in downtown Oakland today as part of the National Day of Rage or Outrage. There was like a unified Juma for the Muslims downtown Oakland. And one of the speakers is someone that, everyone here is probably familiar with, at least, people who've been watching our program, is Amir Abdul Malik Ali. And when he was speaking, he said something that was really interesting to me because he took offense to the idea of calling things riots. Me personally, I really mostly focus on the concepts behind words, but sometimes it's important to make distinctions. Anyway, the point he was making was that he said this is intifada, and I thought that was really interesting because it's like a juncture between Antifa and Intifa, and it's like they met up, they met up in the streets and they had a baby and it was a movement, Anyway, not to be vulgar or anything like that, but my point being, if we look at the history of America, America has a really specific history with riots, right? America has a sordid history full of riots. Anytime, blacks are perceived to gain some type of progress, we see that whites riot. We see that whites riot, and their riots don't destroy property, not in the way we imagine property. We know they imagine us to be property, but their riots tend to destroy us. Their riots tend to focus on us indiscriminately. Any random black person, man, woman, or child could be the site of the white riot. You know what I mean? And this is something that we see clearly throughout history, right? But if we look at, what we're seeing in the streets, it's really hardly comparable to that. Because black people or Antifa or anti-fascists or, white anarchists, however you want to understand the people that are out there, they're not going through white communities and brutalizing man, woman, and child. That's not happening, at least not to my knowledge. And I've been watching pretty closely the videos that are coming out, but to my knowledge, they're not going through communities and indiscriminately doing violence to white women, men, and children, etc., right? So that's something that we also need to keep in the back of our heads, that, one of the ways that they try to frame it is as if this is equal to the kind of white, organized collective vitriol that comes out of whenever there's a perceived progress, and so, I consider them uprisings, and I'm not trying to police anyone's language. That's not my job. You know what I mean? And I understand people in the language they speak, and I make an effort to really understand people in what they're trying to say with the words they use. But, just for thought, for some people who may be struggling with that idea of riots, this is not the same thing as that. This is not the same thing as the historical American white riots. You know what I mean? And then taking into account the things that Gio and Tenzin were saying about this idea of being outside of the labor force, being pushed outside of the labor force, and being pushed into this prison economy, ghetto economy, etc. We're looking at uprisings of captive populations. You know what I mean? We're looking at captive populations that are rising up against their captivity.
Mm. Thank you so much for that, Hannibal. I want to ask George to comment on this as well. Like, how do you think about the charge of outside agitator and also white anarchists?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's being said. There's two, I think, really interesting and kind of inverse points that I would add. One is, if you may have seen a video, I'm pretty sure it's out of Washington, D.C., that shows, I think, how dangerous this narrative is getting, where some men in the crowd start pointing to a young anarchist-looking white dude who's like smashing a rock or something. And they're like, outside agitator, white boy, outside agitator. They grab him. No one in the crowd resists it, and they bring him over, hand him to the police. Now, I'm pretty sure if you've seen that video, I mean, maybe you would disagree, but I think we might probably all agree that they were actually undercover police, right? Yeah. And so it was very easy for them to use this narrative to extract people out of the crowd and to literally hand them over to the police. Even if they weren't police, they were doing police work, which, yeah. You know, but I think they were actually undercover police, which is also an interesting and important point to make. And then I can't help but think about this in relationship to the kind of, you know, like I saw yesterday, someone posted something about etiquette for white protesters. And it was, of course, about policing yourself and policing your own involvement with movements, and not being too provocative and not engaging, in other words, not being any kind of real comrade to people who are engaged in struggle. And so, you know,
I'm sorry, Jill, I gotta jump in there, man, because I'm gonna tell you something, man. If I got my white homies with me and I tell them, hey, go do this thing, they're not about to snitch on me. They're not gonna snitch on me and say it was Hannibal who said do this thing. Now, I'm not telling people to break windows or anything like that, right? But sometimes there's situations where there's extreme situations. Police might be shooting at people, they might be beating us with things, and I've seen white people jump in front of billy clubs and take blows. And I've been protected by them myself, right? And I'm not going to allow anyone to call them snitches or provocateurs. And it's important for us to make that and identify that, right? Because what if, I mean, let's just use our imagination for a second. What if they actually are supporting Black people who ask them to go to the front lines? What if Black people said, hey, it's about to get crazy, we need you guys at the front? Are they supposed to then say all those Black people told me to do this?
Yeah.
No, that's snitching.
Absolutely. And I think that there's this language that's developed around risk and vulnerability that has been used. And this happened in the Oscar Grant stuff as well, where at some point the narrative came forward that, oh, it's people of color can't take risks, right? We see this constantly. We see it today. We saw it in the Occupy ICE stuff where people were saying undocumented people can't take risks. And there's undocumented people there shrugging their shoulders saying, what are you saying? Like, why are you saying that? I'm here taking a risk, right? And the reason for that, of course, is that these same people that are identified as vulnerable are precisely those who have the most to lose with the continuity of the state of affairs, right? And that's why people engage in rebellion. So of course we need to be very, very careful. And of course, like there were people out, you know, a couple blocks from us when everything went down, who were frustrated at some anarchists who had lit some stuff on fire. But there were also hundreds of people standing on the next block ready to throw down as well, right? So these debates are happening, they will happen. But you know, I think we need to resist this narrative, you know, in every way possible, because it's being weaponized by CNN, by nonprofit and city leadership as a way to shut down these demonstrations.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Imran, if you can add to that as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of bring up some statistics from Minneapolis. It may help kind of put something into context in that specific location. And these are numbers straight from the Minneapolis Police Department. So the Minneapolis Police Department themselves have reported that they used force against acts 6,650 acts of violence against Blacks versus 2,700 acts of force against whites within the last 5 years. And these are documented by the police, so the number in reality is actually a lot higher, because as we know, most of these instances go unreported. And that goes to show in the population in Minneapolis of blacks is 20% in Minneapolis versus, in comparison to the white population. In a city where the median income of a black family is less than half of that of a white family. So that can kind of give you some context of the use of police violence against blacks versus whites in that same city. And the actual tactic that was used against George Floyd, that's been documented to have been used 2,600 times in that city, that same tactic that killed George Floyd. And these are just documented by the police department. So it kind of gives you some idea of the rage that community may be feeling against the police.
Oh, no, thank you so much for that. And I think a very important, just kind of something to help our viewers to deconstruct. We've been talking a lot about violence and non-violence, and how I think some people would equate white violence to black violence and all these things. I want to bring Abdulrahman just for him to share like how he defines violence and what his theory of non-violence is.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Better? Alhamdulillah. I think violence, well, I think the theory of non-violence, right? I don't know if I necessarily can define it properly, but know what it's synonymous with. It's synonymous with acceptable, right? And non-violence, from my understanding, in this state, does exist. And quote unquote civil disobedience shouldn't be defined as non-violence, because there's never any moment that we exist within the society when we're not attacked by violence. So even in like choose to not physically maybe defend yourself, you're not practicing non-violence. You're just choosing your way in which you're existing, but violence is always present within society. So I feel like when people use the terms like non-violent or peaceful protest, or even the term like strategic, right? That word gets thrown around a lot, like from well-intentioned and I feel like misintentioned people, but that's also synonymous with like safe or less dangerous, which is something that people are, I feel like, essentially trying to take out of like the Black thought process and rebelling. So it's like there's a monopolization of like what Black people would be doing during protests or should doing during protests, and it's being labeled as strategic. And I feel like that's harmful to the cause. And I feel like it doesn't do us any justice using the terms peaceful protesters or nonviolent, because peace doesn't exist without justice. So even people will say that are practicing civil disobedience, it's not peaceful because you're still devoid of justice. And there is no such thing as nonviolence in a state that only exists through violence. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but.
No, I think that's very helpful, just to kind of help people to work through their definitions of violence, because, you know, with the looting that's been happening and the riots and all this, you see like people are very just uncritical about how they're thinking about all this. If anyone wants to jump in, because I know this is a very important point, just to add something about the violence and the looting and how we should be kind of thinking and framing it for our viewers to kind of understand.
If I could just add a little bit before I pass
to
somebody. Go ahead. I think that violence is the fact that we'll maybe learn for 1 month a year about Black history and a paragraph about Martin Luther King and an educational system. Violence is the fact that that more people are either incarcerated or under state surveillance now than were in 1850. Violence is not breaking a piece of property. Violence is not people resisting outside the confines of what's quote unquote So I feel like what violence is every aspect in which oppression exists, not in any way, shape, or form, comparatively, the way that people are labeling some types of actions. I just wanted to add that.
No, thank you so much for that. Tandini wanted to jump in.
I mean, for me, it's practically, kind of logically strange to think about nonviolence in kind of as a moral value or something. You know, it doesn't make any sense. Malcolm X said it very plainly that the best way to communicate with people is to basically speak their language. If the white man, in quotations, which is much more detailed than just the white man, it's the political economy, it's the legal economy, it's this war on terror, everything, right? The white man is the white man because he's violent. So, and the only language that he truly understands, in which you can actually have some degree of communication, is through violence. And that's just theoretically the case. So now the question is not really about violence. It's like, what is going to be the degree, the cost that you're going to suffer in order to struggle? So if you say, I'm going to be like King, you're still going to get beat up. You're still going to he got killed. So there is going to be a violent reaction to, let's say, people do mass mobilization throughout the American cities, shut down freeways. Look, even all of this stuff, to be honest, a lot of this stuff is, quote unquote, is nonviolent. But the police is tear gassing people, injuring the elderly. The other day, I just saw a video just today, I think, threw this elderly onto the concrete. So, I mean, it's going to be a violent response from the state. And that's a sign that the state is afraid of uprisings. And so for me, it's never a question. That's a strange question, right? Like, to think about it. I'm not saying, Israel, you're asking a strange question. I'm talking about the larger meta narrative outside. It's a violent society. Everything is violent, right? Everything that our children are consuming is violent. Everything that they're being taught is about how to accept this permanent violence and be in this claustrophobic situation where you can't breathe, right? So that is the real violence. That is in every avenue of the society. So the fight back against that has to be a kind of communication, and that is impossible, right? So that should be expected, that there's going to be violence. It's nothing, it's not really a choice, really. You know, we're really making ourselves look like especially when it comes to Black people who are treated as human cargo, that they are somehow has some kind of morality to go against the slave owners. You know, this is a strange bourgeois morality that's being forced upon people who don't have access to bourgeois life. And, you know, so yeah, that's what I think about that.
You know, if I could jump in there.
Go ahead.
One of the things, you know, again, kind of referring back to Amir Abdul-Malik, you know, he talks a lot about civil disobedience, which I find, you know, as a concept is not as problematic as the concept of nonviolent, right? Because a lot of times when people talk about nonviolent action, there's like, you know, there's a broad sort of spectrum of things that one could be referring to. But if we think historically at the things that people consider to be effective, the things that people consider to be effective were very strategic civil disobedience. Now, even with respect to that, there's also nuance there, and there must be understanding there because number one, you have all of these organizations, nonprofits, et cetera, that come in after things get heated up, after the people are already in an uproar, after the people are already in motion and, you know what I mean, and active and actively engaging the oppressors, and they say nonviolence, you know, and Fanon talks about this in Wretched of the Earth in the chapter on violence. You know, he talks about the way in which these bourgeois elements enter the fray after having not been involved, and they introduced the idea of nonviolence, you know, and so there's a couple things with that I want to touch on. Number one is that it's something that's coming in after the fact, right? So they're not coming into our community and identifying the problem and then training the community to address it. They're not coming in training us on how to strategically shut down the problem. They're not coming in and training us in how to strategically organize and mobilize ourselves. They're coming in after the fact and saying, lay down and die. Let's do a die-in, y'all. Let's all get together and teach the kids to do a die-in. Show the police that you're just ready to lay down and die. You know what I mean? And maybe it's gonna move their heart. Yeah, it's gonna move their heart. They're gonna feel like, we don't gotta worry about these ones. You know, put the guns away. They're dying. They're laying down and dying. They're just laying down and dying, right? So yeah, there's that element, right? But we have to consider the fact that the reason we're in the situation now is because so many situations we did not resist. So many situations we just lied down and died. So many situations where people just watched the police kill somebody. And what does it do to us? What does it do to us psychologically, emotionally? And even if we go back to what was considered as effective by the civil rights movement in the past, you know, we're talking about training children to tolerate humiliation. And teaching them is noble, to allow themselves to be berated and constantly humiliated. And I think that's very problematic. We have to come to a point where we understand that that has a huge toll on the mind, on the emotions, on the heart, on the iman, right? If we're talking to Muslims, when you tell a Muslim to continually allow themselves to be humiliated, that's un-Islamic. That's not Islam. Now, if we're just talking about the Black community, or if we're just talking about poor people or anyone else, just anybody, right? Just anybody, psychologically, emotionally, it's a terrible impact on people for them to just be taught to just lie down and take it. You know, and even when you rise up, just rise up to lie down and take it. You know, all the humiliation that's involved with that. And when they do these types of things, and people spontaneously it overwhelms them and they can't tolerate it. And people rise up and say, no, we're tired of laying down. We're tired of laying down with our hands behind our back. We're tired of just letting them kill us. They say, agent provocateur.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They say, oh, you're trying to provoke a chaotic situation. No, Black life is a chaotic situation. Black life is a constant chaos. It's a constant chaotic situation. Lying down, taking it has proven to not change that. They were lying down and doing die-ins in 2012, 2013, 2014, etc. We've been through that process, right? So even a lot of times when people are you know, there's this narrative about, you know, this is more effective, this is gonna, you know, move more people to your cause. The reality of the situation is that fire is what galvanized the young people who refused to take it. You know, when they saw the police burning, it moved people. Yeah. It moved people, and it was a signal of a different kind of consciousness where we're no longer gonna fear the oppressor. We're not gonna fear the blame of the blamers. We're gonna do what's right. We're gonna fight back against oppression to whatever end it may lead us. And then people see that, they see, oh, they're not lying down taking it no more. People can get behind that. People can get behind that. People can support that. People can rally to that. You can't rally to a die-in. You can't rally to a people lying down and taking it. So,
yeah, if I could just piggyback on that, I mean, I think everybody has covered it pretty well, but I just want to say, like, with violence, like, I feel fundamentally like our community, the Black community, people in general don't want to be violent. You know what I'm saying? I don't think that, like, really, I feel like a lot of me personally and a lot of people I know in my direct circles, like, people want peace. You know what I'm saying? Like, we would rather be, you know what I'm saying, living life, enjoying life, you know what I'm saying, spending time with our family. But I mean, the reality is that our oppressors are the violent ones. You know what I'm saying? There's something psychologically in their brain that they're violent. You know what I'm saying? So I just feel like that there's a lot of fear that goes into when people talk about violence. A lot of things I hear from my people, like, they got so many guns, they got tanks, and they got bombs. You know what I'm saying? And that right there is something that I seen that's going to have to get past. You know what I'm saying? I feel like there's going to be a lot of things that happens that's going to force people to be violent. You know what I'm saying? It's just it's just where it's going. If you look at the trajectory of where things going, that's the only thing that this power structure will respond to is violence. I feel like that a lot of people, I know that violence is going to be like it's the last resort to them. You know what I'm saying? It's like when you're back against the wall and you're facing genocide. You know what I'm saying? The only other violence is a tool to be used. You know what I'm saying? And it's an effective tool. It's the only tool, actually. You know, but I feel like everything else is just a trial and error with people to see. You know what I'm saying? Like, this system is not going to change without some sort of violence. It's just not. There's no revolution that's blood. It's not. Malcolm X said it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Revolution is bloodshed. People are going to have to die. People are going to have to shed blood. And I feel it's like that fear of people like, yo, I don't want to die. I'd rather be chilling. You know what I'm saying? I'd rather have peace. You know what I'm saying? But when you look at the reality of the situation, that's probably not going to happen. If we're really following what's going on and look at historical context of what's going on around the world, the people that are rising up and resisting, they have to use violence. You know what I'm saying? And yeah, the oppressor has lots of, man, they dropped atomic bombs and killed like 250,000 people. You know what I'm saying? But the other option, like him said, is dying. You gonna let them kill you? Like our people, we charge genocide. You know what I'm saying? And that's really what's happening. All of the stuff that's going on around is simple. It's genocide. And the only way to resist genocide is violence. And we have to get over that moral stumbling block that somehow using violence is morally wrong. You know what I'm saying?
And you know what, man? And I'm sorry to keep coming on it, but for the believers and for the people with spirituality, a bomb is nothing compared to an angel.
Yeah.
A bomb is nothing compared to an angel. A bullet is nothing compared to an angel. So get on the right track.
Yeah, and that's the material reality of the situation is like, if we really want freedom and we really want a better world for our children, violence is a tool that's going to have to be used no matter if you agree with it or not. You know what I'm saying? If you like it or not, it's just where we're at. And it's sad. It's a sad situation because all the people that I know, all the revolutionaries that I know, they're driven by love. You know what I'm saying? They want peace. You know what I'm saying? But violence is something we have to take the emotion out of. We have to take the emotion out of it. We have to take the morality of it. Strategically, it's effective.
No, thank you so much to the two of you for that. It was just very illuminating. I want to ask George to share his thoughts as well about what do you think about the definition of violence and nonviolence.
Well, I think what the comrades are saying is exactly right, and I always come back to Frantz Fanon as well, who wanted to live in a world of nonviolence, who wanted to live in a world of human equality, but who himself was repeatedly thrown back into conflict, into the realization that wasn't the world that he lived in. And so, shortly before he dies, of course, he says decolonization is a fundamentally violent act. But I think it's important to work through why he says that, right? What are the reasons that decolonization is fundamentally a violent phenomenon? The first, of course, fundamentally is the fact that the colonizer will not abandon their privileges voluntarily. I mean, if the French would leave Algeria, then maybe we'd be dealing with a different situation. But we know that they won't. We know that whiteness as a structure of privilege is not going anywhere voluntarily, right? And so that's the first step. The second step, though, is an important one, especially for thinking through these questions, which is that there are certain people, Black and colonized people, who are ontologically violent for Fanon. In other words, anything they do is violence. In other words, Jordan Davis listening to loud music is violence, right? Standing up king being nonviolent is violence. And we know this, and we know that that's the way that the structure operates, and that talking too loudly is violent, and that being too public is violent in a space where you're supposed to be, hyper surveilled, and this paradoxical invisibility that goes with a hyper visibility if you stick out too much, or if you appear in a space where you're not supposed to appear. So Black and colonized people, for Fanon, are condemned to violence, which in many ways changes the calculation of, well, if there's no virtue of being nonviolent, then I'll just be purely strategic, right? It's not a question of what works and what doesn't. And then the third fundamental point for Fanon is the fact that in a world in which inequality has been imposed and inculcated, and in which what he calls even inferiority complexes develop, and the feeling that you can't fight back against the master develops, or they're going to win, or they have too many weapons. He argues that something that will manifest as violence is necessary, because it's actually necessary for the subjective development of people to recreate themselves, right? And I think we all know this on a basic level, which is that even just the other night, the empowering feeling of standing out there facing off against the police, or looting downtown Philadelphia, or doing things that you're not supposed to be able to do, right? And beginning to realize that the system is not invincible, and that the police are not invincible, and that if enough people get together, then this change can really happen. Again, that doesn't mean always deadly violence, but it will always be coded as violence, because it's that kind of ontological disruption of a system that is based on that not existing. And that's why it's so unthinkable, right? And that's why it's so impossible for mainstream media to understand. And this gets back to a lot of Tanzim's points, which is the fact that, you know, and things that people brought up around civil society and civility and civil debate and even citizenship, these are all ideas that are based on the idea of ontological equality. In other words, that everyone is a human being to begin with, which is not the way the system is set up, right? So when someone tells you to be civil, it's because you're disrupting the framework of polite debate, right? And if someone tells you to be nonviolent, it's because you're disrupting the perception that that's how the world changes, is through nonviolent activism. But those things are not the way that the world works.
Well, thank you so much for that, George. I want to go to a point that we've kind of been discussing, but I think it's important for us just kind of to think critically through. So how do you think about race traitor whites historically, and their role in the struggle against white supremacy? Because I think at this moment, what you've seen is like the nonprofit sector, and just kind of the neoliberal sector in general, is kind of monopolizing a lot of you know, just cultural like anti-Blackness, to say that, oh, whites who agitate in the struggle or in riots should not be allowed, or this kind of like conversation is becoming very, very popular. So I want to ask you how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to assume that the question was for me, because
yeah.
You know, like Malcolm X says, is like, if you want to be an ally, tell me what you think about John Brown, right? And I think there's a reason that John Brown exists as a model for race treason, and you know, and that's essential. That doesn't mean elevating him above Harriet Tubman. That doesn't mean making him something outside of the struggle. It means precisely understanding his role within the struggle, and as someone who was not fearful of that struggle, and someone who took on risks that you know, he opted into risks that he could have just chilled and not been subject to. And I think that's something to be celebrated, and it's something that that needs to be understood, you know, as a constant task, right? And attempt to live up to that. Now, of course, there are ways that you know, a white kid smashing something may think that they're doing something like that, and they're not really, right? Or may actually be provoking something that may be dangerous for some people. Like tactically, of course, that's the case. The question is, on what level are people willing to give up the privileges of whiteness and disrupt it? I will say, however, that I think, you know, and I've been involved in organizations that were explicitly race traitor organizations, but that also, you know, we run the risk when we organize our politics around that of centering whiteness, right? You know, of creating an organization that is actually not about internationalism and revolutionary unity, but is about specifically what is it that white people can do. And when you take that to an extreme, I think you get to some of the, you know, some of the bad politics that we're seeing in the street today, which is a watering down of that narrative. The, you know, ally, I think the idea of the ally is incredibly corrupted at this point, because it does a couple of things. One is it uncritically embraces POC leadership in ways that we've seen can be devastating and can be used by the system, or, you know, or can be the worst kind of leadership, you know, and then when there's no criticism involved. But it also lets white people off the hook, because they're told you don't have to judge your leadership, right? They're told you don't have to take a position. All you have to do is show up and do the right thing. And I think it's a cop out for, you know, for white people as well. And I think revolutionary internationalism is a struggle to, in a very difficult way, balance, for example, of course, autonomous Black and brown revolutionary organizing and spaces with a real kind of, not allyship, but comradeship, you know, co-conspirators instead of allies, as people put it, and accomplices, right? And people who are really willing to be engaged in those struggles fully.
No, thank you so much for that, George.
Up in to make a few points on that.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, just listening to him speak and listening to the question, it makes me think about like when like white settlers were before you were labeled like blacks were labeled chattel slavery. Like when they first came, it was more like indentured servitude, and like when white settlers, they got together with Africans and were going against the landowners, and they had to divide that by like labeling you're white and you're a slave for life, you know what I'm saying? And I feel like a lot of times, like even with some white supremacist groups, man, they are fundamentally going against their own interests by pushing like the narrative of white supremacy. So whenever I see like a white ally out here in the struggle with us, depending on based how I talk to them, I feel like you actually are fighting for your own interests now. You know what I'm saying? Because like, yeah, there's racial divides and cultural
divides. But in a good way, right? Yeah. Not like a selfish kind of way.
Right. Yeah. So it's like fundamentally, it's fun. I feel like it's fundamentally sound for them to actually join these struggles, because if you really look at it, there is a 1%, there is a landowning class question here. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes being a racial traitor is actually joining your class of people, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Because there's a lot of poor racist people where it'd be like, yo, you need to be out here fighting with us. You know what I'm saying? So I just wanted to add that point. It's like a lot of time these whites, these middle class whites are fighting against their own interests when they're being racist, you know what I'm saying? Because you have your own economic oppression going on, you know? So you might as well join the right side.
Did anybody else want to add to that question as well before I shift the gears?
Yeah, can I simply add a little bit?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that one of the reasons why Malcolm wanted to go with Islam is because it allowed for a huge corpus of theological discourse that suggested that retaliation is permissible by the divine. So that was the old time religion, and he studied that. He wanted to understand that. And I think it is very important then for us to think about not at the level of just violence is moral or immoral, but what are the resources available in what we're invested in, and how can we respond for keeping our dignity, our izzah. And that's really important for those who are part of Islamic struggle. I mean, there's a war on terror, which is a war on Islam. And now we're seeing that the dispositif of counterterrorism is going to be used against people who are part of these uprisings. We also saw under Trump that the Ferguson protests, which was very phenomenal, a lot of those folks got killed extrajudicially, the real militants. That they were identified by the Trump administration as Black identity extremists, which is directly from the counterterrorism discourse. So there is a deep connection between the originary de-Islamization of Black population and now this kind of linkage between those who are considered paradigmatically slaves and those who are considered the paradigmatic enemy. And Malcolm understood that. So he understood that in order to be even an enemy who's respected, he would have to stand up. And he found the resources in Islam to be extremely relevant for the liberation of his people. And that is really significant. And in fact, he was influencing Christian Black theologians to move towards liberation theology. So the Black people who wanted to be militant and stay Christian, Malcolm encouraged them to think more through a concept of Jesus that allowed for fighting back against the oppressors. And I think that's really significant for us to keep in mind as we think about like, what are the resources that are available for us? And the other thing I just want to quickly add is Fanon in Resident of the Earth, in the chapter on colonialism and mental disorder, talks about that collective level. For the first time that the colonized feels like he is kind of recovering is when he stands up for himself and throws the first punch. You know what I'm saying? Like he acts on his own behalf, and he realizes that he is now standing up. He's becoming the new human who was subjugated this entire time. And so even as a form, that's why when we go to these uprisings, there's this kind of deep sense that we have something that's moving inside of us. There's an affective feeling that even in the most serious form of danger we're faced with, there's a sense of self that that comes from somewhere. It's actually that precise kind of psychic dimension of uprisings. So the better the protest, the better the condition and healing that can happen. As far as white folks are concerned, if you're interested in the disarticulation of white supremacy, then white folks have to abolish themselves. And that's an epistemic question. And they cannot do that if they do not take those risks. Of course, that in their case, it's a kind of voluntary situation. They have to make that decision. They're not going to necessarily give up what they have, this kind of social power, just to be white. So when we have the John Browns, when we have the race traders, and that kind of new sociality is created through struggle, that's when the abolition of whiteness can actually begin. A process can happen. And I think that's really significant in that sense as well. Yeah.
You know, and I'm sorry to keep this question going. But we have to think about the fact of the way America is using rhetoric around terrorism, right? So right now they want to label anti-fascists as terrorists, right? And this comes how many years after the FBI said that all levels of law enforcement have been infiltrated by white supremacist organizations. Yet none of them seem to warrant the label of terrorism. Right. But people who quote unquote break windows and incite uprisings, according to the state anyway, you know, by them standing with Black people who are being, you know, executed and assassinated and exterminated through genocide, by them standing with those people who are under this oppression, they're terrorists. But the white supremacists who infiltrated the state, who infiltrated, according to the state, right? Now, I believe, of course, that they've been a part of the state the whole time. That's my own understanding. But according to the state, they infiltrated every level of law enforcement, but they're not really a threat. They're just here kicking it with us. They brought the bacon and the ribs to the barbecue. You know, but the ones who fight back against the murder and executions of Black people, they're terrorists. And that goes, and it gets to the idea of that Tanzeen's talking about, you know, them abolishing themselves and abolishing whiteness, you know, and I'm reminded of the way that the apartheid regime in South Africa utilized this language of terrorism and utilized this idea of, you know, a white person losing their status as a white man and being considered as an albino terrorist. That once you really rebuke and renounce your whiteness, it puts you in the level of terrorist, right? That's how the apartheid state looked at it. And if you weren't considered an albino terrorist, you hadn't fully renounced your whiteness. You know what I mean? And we're seeing that same kind of rhetoric coming out of the state now. You know, so I feel like that's worthy of note. And we as people who are being targeted to be considered as terrorists, whether we're talking about Black people or we're talking about Muslims, we cannot allow anyone else to be put into the category of terrorists, right? In the sense that we can't just sit by and not respond to that, right? What they're doing is they're trying to scare off our friends. They're trying to scare off our friends.
The very few that we have, you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Like, well, what's the point? You know what I mean? Like, And the other thing is Islam forces a kind of charitable life. So, you know, the fact that people who have access to wealth and they're part of the struggle, they can be engaged in also redistributing some of the wealth. So if you got like these whites who are fighting against their own family members having histories of wealth, you know, some of that could be taken out and redistributed, and that could be a huge help. Like all kinds of resources. When you have a full-out war, you need all the resources you can if you're really serious about it. So there's a war going on against a majority of the world, and there has to be a struggle that is able to tap into different resources for sure. And that's another dimension, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and also specifically this point about, I mean, you just kind of seen this like really just now in the popular imagination about labeling protesters as terrorists. So, and then even like, you know, Trump with the National Guard, you really see kind of this, you know, this narrative of like the war being brought home, the front lines are here, this kind of thing. And I think it's allowing for, again, not like the term continues about like a mass militancy on the ground, but also kind of like an internationalization of like struggle as well. How we're kind of connected to struggle internationally and here, you know. And I think one friend was like, you know, when Trump had announced that he was going to bring the army in to kind of shoot down these protesters, a friend nicely put it in a way and said, well, they're already killing us abroad, you know, so kind of like this connection's been already been working on. I want to point a question to Abdulrahman and ask, what does it mean for Trump to invoke a slavery era policy around slave insurrection? I think you're muted. Yeah, okay, you're good.
Okay, so I think it speaks to how afraid he and the state is at what's going on. Because that's like pretty much making it clear the positioning of a government that's trying to pretend, you know, it's this semblance of freedom and equality and all this stuff. So to do that, I think speaks to the fact of how desperate the state is to contain the rising Black militancy. So I feel like, you know, for a long time, people will say things, what you hear until it's clear that, you know, you need the bare facts. And so when you need the bare facts, it's like you're backed up against a wall. So him basically, you know, acting this, it's like he makes it very clear of our position in this society. So it's like, one, we got to let go of the illusion that we're going to be treated fairly, and then two, it's like when someone, I believe it was George Jackson who said, when someone, when the fascists swing out at you desperately, or a man swings out at you desperately, it's because he's afraid to lose the fight. Paraphrasing style. So the fact that he will make it so clear by enacting this racist law, it kind of shows that the state doesn't have as many tricks in its bag as it was trying to floss with Obama. So I feel like it should make it pretty clear on the way we're treated. Also, that the fact that what's happening now is working, in my opinion.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I think we're getting close to the time, so I wanted to ask each panelist here about. I think a lot of the viewers from back home and just watching right now, they're kind of like confused about what's going on right now and how they should be reading the militancy and whatnot. So from your perspective, how should we be categorizing this militancy and how does it relate to protests from before? Like, how should we be thinking about this?
Can I respond to that one, inshallah?
Yeah.
You know, one thing that's important, I feel, and I want to reiterate it, and I constantly try to bring it up because I'm also, you know, communicating with people in other places. I'm also building with people who may not have a protest background. in order to build on the consciousness, right? And you know I refer back to the fact that when people saw the police catch fire, it's like, yo, you know, it's like the whole world was like, yo, the imperialist, the slave master is in trouble. It's not the time to step back. Now's the time to kick. You know, it's like when the bully hits the ground, that's when all the feet come up. You know what I'm saying? And what I mean by that is, if the bully's been beating on Tim, right, and Tim finally gets him on his back, I'm definitely not gonna miss an opportunity to kick him while he's going down. I'm gonna tell you that, because he's been around the world, bullying the whole world, bombing, destabilizing, destroying economies, destroying communities, destroying the relationship between communities, playing our quote unquote leaders against us, using our own quote unquote leaders against us, you know, and just creating this generalized violence, subjugation, humiliation. And when people see him slip, it's like, oh, you weak right now? It's like this person done robbed you. You know, when I was a kid, I got robbed by this guy on several occasions. We lived in the same neighborhood. And one time he tried to rob me, but he didn't have his gun. And once I realized he didn't have his gun on him, I was like, oh, bro, you done messed up now, because I see you don't have it. We're going to fight now. And you know, I mean, you know, I had to get with him, you know. He never tried to rob me again.
If I could just piggyback, since we're on the same mic, I'm going to get mine out now. So I want to say that I feel like people should look at this as like, we haven't arrived, you know what I'm saying? But I feel like it's a very, very good reinvigoration of struggles that have happened, you know, because I feel like it goes in waves, you know what I'm saying? I feel like, man, when like, unfortunately, it always happens around the state killing somebody, but people rise up, you know what I'm saying? And like for the past 7 years with Trump, I feel like it's has been a very low point for the movement, man. A lot of, like, we were just struggling to get back to a place of resistance, you know what I'm saying? And so I feel like we should be able to, like Huey say, take this phenomenon that's happening and make it work in our favor and define it, you know what I'm saying? There's a lot of work going on, man. Like 150 million from the police in LA, that's not a small chunk. I'm not against, you know, I'm not for no reform, but I'm happy to see that happening. Right. And like the school police, like even in Oakland, I think they're going to do they're going to be going to a school board member's house to get the police out of schools now, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like it's a time to reinvigorate, you know, agitation and struggle, you know what I'm saying? Because the temperature is right for it right now, you know what I'm saying?
And I'm sorry to keep going, but and on the point of removing the police from the schools, we're talking about at a historical point when the nation was really moving towards this hyper police state of schools, like all these school shootings, like the fear that existed at the level of, you know, disgruntled youth, right? So that's another element that can't be ignored, the level of disgruntled youth that's shooting up schools, the fear around it. It got trumped by, you know, this current consciousness where they're like, look, we just got to get the police out of here. We can't have them in our spot because then we're going to be under pressure. The people are going to be looking at us like, let's just get rid of them.
Yeah, and that's what just to continue is just to say that look at these reforms that happen, and not as a point of like we have arrived, but it's an opportunity to add people to the movement, to organize people, to get involved, because the environment is up, and we have to take, because who's to say how long it's going to last, because the state is very hyper vigilant about trying to squash this, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like we have to be able to really analyze what's going on right now and take advantage of it as much as we can, you know what I'm saying? And like I said, I'm not for reform. I don't think reform, I think all reform is evidently going to be rolled back, or it's doomed to fail, you know what I'm saying? Because the state is always going to keep pressing back on us. If we get the police, if we defund the police, there's going to be some private rich people to fund the police, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like every reform circles back to some more resistance. So I feel like we should just look at this time now as a way to increase consciousness of the masses, to get involved in different struggles. Because I think it's fun. I think it's cool to be able to be like, yo, man, let's have let's get at the police. Like, y'all don't get no more money. Y'all got to get up out these schools. Yeah, you got 57 people quitting on your force. You know what I'm saying? I feel like we should take advantage. It's like checks, man. If we getting close to a checkmate, it's not no time to just sit back. You know what I'm saying? We got to move to pieces.
Yeah. That's so true. Yeah, Tanzini, you want to just to kind of state your...
I just want to add that so many people contacted me from the Islamic world and encouraged what's happening in a positive way. One of the things that's really important for us to also understand, as powerful as a state is, it also is finite. It doesn't have infinite power, infinite resources. It has to redistribute its own resources when it deals with a militant protest. So one of the ways that, when the weathermen talked about bring the war home, the idea was if you actually have enough agitation and interruption of society, of a racist society here, then the state would have to concentrate here. And as a result, it would allow for some breathing room in other places, because we've been under war for 20 years dealing with the latest technology of counterterrorism. That's the Islamic world since 2001. So it's going to be a very difficult road ahead. Those of the people who are actually in it, they should study counterterrorism really well. And one way that it directly helps the Islamic world is when the state gets busy. When you see all these states like, oh, I'm going to put National Guard in there, I'm going to put the army in this situation, it actually inhibits the state from getting busy in other places. So it's actually an interconnected world. And in that sense, it's really important to even understand the struggle in that sense, right? So if you keep the police busy because he doesn't know what to do anymore, right? I mean, what we saw in Minneapolis was so beautiful because the police were simply overpowered. They just didn't know what to do with so many people being militant. It just, and that's why I was talking about, like, it has a kind of unruliness, which also tactically made a tremendous kind of rational sense in outmaneuvering the cops. And that's really significant and important. And when you think about, and I'm saying this as an academic now, is when you think about the destruction of property and destruction of things and resources, that hurts a state which is going through a political economic crisis. Now it has to deal with that. One of the reasons why America lost the war against the Taliban is because how they cannot actually keep up with it. And the resistance is so stubborn. And once you have something very significant here with masses of people, all the different tactics that they're using, that's fine. As long as they keep the state busy in trying to respond to them, that's really going to be important for folks who are outside. And I think that's really something we should consider and think about, that this is a totalizing war. And the reason why they use this term is not just hypothetically. When they're saying this is domestic terrorism potentially, and we're going to see a lot of people probably going to get terrorism charges. A lot of people are probably going to go through things. And so this is very serious. And so the state is looking inside and trying to find the Islamist figure, let's say, as to who are these tremendous troublemakers that mess up the resources that the state has.
Really important, great points, Tanzeen. I want to ask Imran for his last comments on, I guess, how you observe the mass militancy happening and what do you think is going to happen going forward?
Well, I would just say that, white supremacy is the real global pandemic. And, the depressed people of the world have been under quarantine for too long. And what we're seeing now is different types of vaccines that are being developed. And it's going to take a global response to fight a global virus. And, there's going to be different types of vaccines that are going to work and different types of vaccines that are being tested right now. So we need to keep testing the vaccine because this virus is constantly mutating. So we need to try different vaccines to defeat this global virus that is white supremacy.
Thank you so much for that. Abdulrahman, do you have any also, I guess, last comments, last observations about everything that's been going on? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Okay. My bad, I'm technologically illiterate. One thing that I'm kind of like reflecting on as a Muslim, and I want to say as like a person, as someone who has no formal training, but like El Hajj Malik, I feel like my sincerity is my credentials. And looking the story of Prophet Ibrahim, alayhi salam, and the fact that smashing of the idols, and the fact that he had family members who were idol makers, who gained wealth off making these idols. And that we know America in of itself creates idols out of the concept of wealth. Mm-hmm. So when I'm seeing like all this stuff get smashed, all this stuff that represents wealth of the oppressor and tyrants, and how the country, this country in particular, idolizes the concept of wealth and money, I'm just reminded of the story of Ibrahim and the fact that, you know, all this stuff, I almost cursed, all this stuff got to burn and smash in service of the one God. That's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, no, that's really, really important, especially very poignant to the point about idol smashing and everything, for sure. I want to bring in George for, I guess, your last comments and observations as well.
So, you know, I've been asking comrades coast to coast from the beginning of all this, and everyone agrees that this is not like something they've seen before. And I'm old, so it's like anything I've seen before. It means that it hasn't happened in a long time. And like I said, we saw in Oakland, we saw, you know, of course, you know, courageous rebellions in Baltimore and in Ferguson, but they didn't spread in this way. They didn't target police in this way. They didn't generalize in the way that these are generalizing. And I think it's no accident. We're, you know, we're in a moment of deep capitalist crisis where capitalism entered into a crisis of accumulation in the late 60s, and it's kind of coasted the rest of the century out with credit, with people taking on debt, with a whole variety of bubbles that are beginning to collapse. Student loans, of course, are a part of that. You know, credit card debt that people are accumulating because there's no other way to spend. And that's collapsing. The solutions of the center are collapsing. In other words, the European Union, NAFTA, these attempts to create a liberal, democratic, centrist capitalism for stabilizing the global order are collapsing. And what happens is that we're in a moment of radical polarization and instability, where there's options on the far right and there's options on the far left. There's options that radically look beyond this order to replace it with something better. And then there's options that are trying to retrench white supremacy, to put up walls, you know, physical walls, ontological walls, to stabilize that, you know, those privileges. And they're on the defensive with that, and we're pushing forward. And I think that's the way that these struggles are moving us. And we're living through, you know, to put it in a slightly different way, an escalating cycle of rebellion, where we're learning from things that have happened before. Young people on the streets, it's been so striking here that the age, right? It's under 20-year-olds that are leading this. And it's partly because they've grown up with the names Trayvon Martin. They've grown up with the names of those murdered by police brutality, and they're breaking with their, you know, their old ways. These two pieces are connected because, you know, part of what's happening is that the system can no longer buy off the loyalties of large parts of the population anymore. And so people are breaking free of that and looking for their true interests, as Tim put it. And, you know, and I think I'm intensely optimistic. These are dangerous times, profoundly dangerous times, I think. But they're times in which the struggles have been opened up and they're driving forward. So I want to thank you all for having me in to talk about these things today.
Well, thank you so much, George, for those last comments and observations, and everybody here. I think I would like to say, I think relative to all of you guys here, my experience in organizing is shorter and younger. But I think for me, I guess my experience in speaking with like younger people, you really have to admire how advanced and intelligent their analysis of the current moment is, and how far behind those who claim to be their leaders, like within the nonprofits and whatnot, really just can't really capture and understand them. And I think this is a really important point on George's last point about how these kids have been growing up with like seeing Trayvon Martin and not wanting to kind of compromise with the state any further and the neoliberal, sectors anymore, including nonprofits and, all these mainstream activists. So I think it's really, really important. So I want to say thank you guys for being here. Thank you to all of our Milestones viewers. It's really, really important roundtable, important conversations. We hope that you guys continue to engage with this a little bit. Please take some time to kind of self-reflect on this moment as well and how you can, just kind of develop yourself in this moment because it is very, very unique. So thank you and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.